Trump should be focusing on instead of Canada?
Where to now? On my way.
You're right.
Looking for something?
You're right. You're
I'll
right.
find a way.
Absolutely, you're right. For sure. 100%. He's doing both? I guess so, right? But like this, like we agree though that like this is more important in Canada.
The U.S. military is being sent to the southern border with special forces being deployed into Mexico. Everybody expects the cartels to fight back against this. But the Marines are getting ready for what comes next, which could be assaults on the border by armed cartel members or targeted attacks against Border Patrol agents by snipers who we're now learning are more heavily armed than most people even realize.
Ready for battle.
Using drones
done.
to drop explosives
Fleet
on rival
deployment
cartel members,
acknowledged.
or even the military, even explosives that are laid on the ground as far as IEDs.
So like those troops, those were not the Mexican military. Those are the cartels. They're essentially a rogue army deployed to the Mexican side of the border. And experts say there's a good chance this army is ready for war. In fact, they're already at war with themselves and with the Mexican government, and it's feared they
See, that's probably another issue that they have, is that like, you know, I would say that if I was them, the walls are kind of like, you know, they're kind of closing in on them, right? Where they're fighting with each other because they all don't get along. And then they're also fighting with probably the Mexican government that's got pressure on them from the U.S. Then they're fighting with the U.S. Like, it's just, they're fucked. I mean, really, they're fucked. It'll fall apart. Well, I think you'll still have a little bit of cartel behavior. It'll probably be, like, what I think will probably happen is that, this is my understanding at least, is that, like, you know, the old, like, you know, Godfather level, like, you know, mafia doesn't really exist in the same way they used to, right? It's not the same type of culture. Like, it's still around, but not really. I think probably the same thing will end up happening to the cartels, is that it'll just be like a huge nerf.
Control group created.
May be at war with U.S. law enforcement, creating a situation so unpredictably dangerous that reporters are now being issued body armor. And, as you're about to see, our troops may now face battlefield threats they've never seen before.
So they're getting desperate. So we got our hands on some video. That video showing the cartel quite literally dropping a bomb.
So these cartels, they have been making massive amounts of money off the opportunity at America's border, which was previously wide open, but now that's over. And their business is now toast, but they're not going to accept that. The New York Post is calling them kamikaze drones. Here's a photo of a drone like this being used in Ukraine right now. Look at that thing.
I mean, I feel like this doesn't necessarily have to, like, I mean, this is, I've seen like 5 videos of these like killing drones. Like, I've seen so many videos of like drones killing people in like Ukraine. I've probably seen like 20 videos of this.
More crystal is
bigger than the drone.
Now with these drones that have the capabilities of actually dropping explosives, it really shows how much more these cartels have evolved.
I don't like watching it, I just see it.
Has increased even more so now.
So before we get into how President Trump and our military are going to stand up against this threat and defeat it, it's important to understand that these drones and this technology, this is a new thing in modern warfare, and it's changing the face of battlefields all over the place. First of all, these things are incredibly inexpensive. They make it very unsafe to be on a battlefield. You can't hide in a trench because these things drop items on top of you.
Violence between two factions, Samoa cartel, goddamn.
On top of that, tanks, armored vehicles, most of these have weaker armor in areas that traditional weapons that would hit them in the front might not be able to reach, like the roof or the back.
Sure.
And unless you're going to fight fire with fire, there's really no way law enforcement's going to be able to stand up against this. Apparently, they've got spy planes that are now flying over the border, keeping an eye on things in a way that's never been done before. And using
I can't really imagine that like the cartel has spy planes that we're not able to track. I mean, if we can track nuclear submarines, we can probably track spy planes, right? I mean, I just think that they're probably not letting it happen. Or they're not, they don't, I mean, let's be real, right? There are planes, and yeah, no, you're right about that, is that I remember that Mexican president, she said one thing I agree with. She said, why is it that all of these cartels have gear and items that were meant for exclusive use of the U.S. military? How did that happen?
Research complete.
I think that's a great question.
No,
really good question. These are your points? Yeah, yeah. These are American points. We've seen these before. These are like those Pelicans in Halo.
High-tech surveillance equipment like this is going to help the U.S. military find these drone operators, find these cartel members, catch them as they're sneaking around, plotting to ambush our troops and our law enforcement officers as they keep America safe.
Along the southern border this morning, signs of President Trump's long-promised crackdown on immigration as the 1,500 troops sent to the border begin their new mission. In the air and on the ground.
This is a full-blown military occupation of the U.S. border. This is crazy.
Yeah,
you can even see the border wall behind them, but that's not enough. They need troops and tanks. And if you're a cartel member, the sight and sound of military vehicles in the skies and on the ground on the U.S. side will definitely throw a wrench in your plan. Because these cartels, they bring products into the country which are illegal. And they bring people into the country illegally, which is how they make money. But you can't do that if there's a massive presence on the other side of a border wall.
I mean, if I was the cartels, I would probably just try to wait it out. Like like that's what I would do if I was them, right? I would say, okay, we're gonna have to just like lay low for 4 years, or like 2 years, and then just 4 years is too long. Nah, I mean, like they live fast though. I mean, I don't know. I mean, a lot of these guys probably do it for like 15 years. They won't. I mean, I'm just saying, like, I mean, if that was me, that's what I would do, right? If I was them, I don't know. Like, I haven't been in a cartel before. Not yet.
Looking at you 24 hours a day, whether it's daytime or nighttime, and is ready to stop you. Then it seems to be working. It says right here, border crossings have hit record lows and could be on track to be at the lowest level they've ever been in 60 years. They're down more than 90% compared to February.
Jesus Christ.
Scouts have found a colonizable planet. Ready
90%?
for battle.
Do you think the U.S. will invade Canada? They focus on paying American citizens to traffic drugs for them. I mean, like, and also, like, if I really wanted to get drugs across, I probably wouldn't do it through the border. Like, I mean, I don't know, why can't they do it through, like, somewhere in Florida, maybe, or, like, somewhere on a coast? Because I feel like that's a smarter idea, right? I mean, like, that'd be, they do, that's a better idea, in my opinion. They do, yeah. Tunnels? I don't know what kind of tech they have to detect tunnels. So, like, I'm not sure what kind of, like, sonar, like, imaging they have for that, so I'm not sure.
This won't be so easy.
February 2024. Look at this chart right here. This is crazy. The numbers of people that were coming in 2022 and 2023, that's nuts. And this has only taken about 3 weeks, something we were told was never going to happen. And in the middle of the asylum crisis, America was told that we had the most secure border we've ever had, and that everything...
Well, these are the same people that were telling you that Joe Biden wasn't retarded.
No armor!
So, I mean, they're just making shit up as much as they can. I mean, these people are writing fan fiction. They're telling stories. I mean, let's be honest, right? I mean, yeah, he's sharp as a tack. Yeah, just not the sharp part of the tack. The other part.
Could possibly be done to keep it safe and to stop people coming across was already being done, but it looks like that wasn't exactly true now, was it?
The troops deployed to address what Trump has declared is a national emergency.
What exactly do you want them to be doing right now?
Making sure that the border is safe and secure and that criminals don't come into our country.
Imagine
the surge in forces comes as the situation on the border has improved steadily since former President Biden announced new asylum restrictions last spring. Encounters between border patrol.
Yeah, that's what did it. The asylum restrictions, not the troops, not the tanks, not the massive military buildup, and border crossings started dropping even before Trump got into office.
Well, it's also people don't want to come over, right? I mean, like, if you are, like, let's say you're in Mexico and you're trying to come across the border, there's definitely going to be a reduction in people that are going to try to go and take advantage of that.
This is his 5th overall, and the first of his 2nd term, about 43.
I don't know why the fuck that happened.
Planet.
Anyway,
Commander.
fuck, what was I even saying?
Our fleet is under attack.
Let me go back around on myself.
And border crossings started dropping even before Trump.
Oh yeah. I mean, if you knew this shit was going to happen, like I would try to get in early or get out, right? I wouldn't do it. No, I just have a bunch of tabs open and shit like that. Yeah, I wouldn't come over, exactly.
Civilian structure complete.
Got into office, people knew that he was going to do something like this, and they said, you know what, it's not worth it. But as you're about to see, this might not be enough to stop these cartels. Because they're not just going to sit around and lose billions of dollars and do nothing. They're going to take action, which is going to put everybody at risk. People in Mexico, people in America, especially those down at the border right now, trying to stop these guys. So here, Border Patrol agents have discovered a smuggling tunnel that went underneath border security measures. Look at this thing. Apparently it was held up by just wooden beams. It was incredibly dangerous. Here you can see the troops checking it out.
See how fun this.
Attack!
That
Ready for battle.
Damn. Mexican here to report that people, so many brilliant brains getting out of the country to work on a low wage.
For me?
They have many tunnels. I mean, like, if I was them, I would do that, right?
Complete.
I mean, fuck, it's smart to make a tunnel.
Attack!
Yeah, of course.
Underneath border security measures. Look at this thing. Apparently, it was held up by just wooden beams. It's incredibly dangerous. Here you can see the troops checking it out. And you know what's surprising about this is that these cartels were even able to dig such a tunnel. I mean, there are underground listening devices which can be used to pick up excavation-related activity. You can see them carrying bags of stuff out of this place right now and handing it over. That's evidence of some sort. Who knows what they had in that tunnel or who they had in that tunnel. But this just goes to show you how sophisticated this rogue army is and what they're willing to do to continue bringing things into our country that shouldn't be here. Not just people, not just products, but also things that could be used to harm those of us who live here, and which fall into the hands of gang members, which they then use to coerce and exploit their fellow immigrants in the very communities they come here and try to embed themselves with. And what's truly shocking is that it looks like this army that is south of the border is trying to move some sort of army or military presence into this country.
This was in the desert near Y, Arizona. Now, sheriffs down here along the southern border and other law enforcement, they have their eyes not only on what's coming in, but also what is coming out. Here's why. Because they know that when they see guns and money coming...
Hold up.
All packed up and ready to go.
That's a lot.
How can I be of service? Fleet deployment acknowledged.
That's a lot of guns.
What do you need to know? On my way.
Jesus.
Where do you need me?
Since October. Oh my God.
Also what is coming out. Here's why, because they know that when they see guns and money coming out of the country going towards Mexico, that means whatever the cartels were moving into the country, they were successful. Take a listen.
Yeah.
These are all American
all these weapons coming through, all that money coming through, is that they were successful, and with that money, they're buying things.
Yeah, of course.
So right there, all of the stuff that's coming across the border, the stuff that gets confiscated and that gets taken out, that's alarming to people that are watching this because this is just a small portion of what's actually coming through, the stuff that gets caught. There's larger stuff that's all in the hands of the law.
Well, of course they're bringing over machine guns and shit. I mean, obviously, I don't think that they're using those machine guns. Like, if I was them again, I bet they probably use those to shoot other people that they don't like. Like, they probably don't use that against law enforcement. I mean, like, I'm sure sometimes they do. It happens. But I feel like that's probably a last resort for them. And like, yeah, and to sell them. Yeah, they do. No, of course they're going to do it if they have to. But, like, again, if they do that, right? I mean, and this is a very common thing that a lot of criminals know, is that the last thing that you want to do is attack law enforcement. Like, that's basically, like, that's cornered animal behavior. So, like, if you see them doing that, it's not good.
A sound plan. Brace for combat.
It's a no-brainer. Yeah, exactly. If they do that, they're done. Yeah.
Give the order.
Weapons, they didn't get into our country for free. What on earth could those be used
Civilian
for?
structure
Who
complete.
paid for them to come in here? The Mexican cartels don't need it. After all, they're the ones selling it. Somebody else needs all those weapons. But the other part of stopping these cartels...
Y'all say Trump's live? Why y'all say Trump's live?
What now?
Live? What are y'all talking about?
How can I be of service?
He's not live yet. Yeah, it's not for a bit, bro.
That war with Ukraine and Russia.
Just a short detour while we clear a path.
I'll look at that after I finish.
Civilian research tier complete. Scouts have found a
Y'all get me
colonizable planet.
fucked up.
Is stopping what may be accomplished by their nefarious activities inside this country, because some of what they're doing does get through.
Target's coming out the house.
ICE enforcement and removal operations officers have been watching his movements and patterns for days now.
Civilian structure complete.
The suspect, an illegal migrant from Mexico, convicted in 2004 for alien smuggling.
This
and
will
already
only
removed
take
from
a
the
minute.
U.S. in 2005, but snuck back in.
These are the kinds of people that we're at war with, both outside of the border and inside of our country. This guy's already been kicked out.
He got back.
Now he's back somehow. Could he have come in as a quote-unquote asylum seeker under a false identity? We know that people did that who ended up being dangerous once they got here. But here's why it makes sense for the cartels to get their people back into the country. If they're bringing all of these weapons and all of these items in here, and those are going to be sold, who's going to make sure that that goes down the way it's supposed to? Who's going to make sure payment gets made? Who's going to keep an eye on all that stuff when it makes its way from the cartels and gang members to the other gang members that are here who are going to buy it and pick it up? People like this guy.
Yeah, there are public safety threats or national security threats. They've had their due process. They've never shown up for deportation. Those are our primary targets.
So they didn't show. They were going to get deported, but they didn't show up to get deported. So they just got.
How many people roughly are on this target list?
We've got multiple lists.
How
so
can
it's
I
hard
be
to
of
say
service?
one specific number.
I'll do my best.
Hundreds in
Where do
Houston?
you need
On
me?
the list, thousands.
Thousands. Thousands
Reporting
of
That's
people
crazy.
like this are in our country right now who could be potentially dangerous.
How
Who could
can I
be
be of
affiliated with
service?
some of the worst criminal organizations on our entire planet. Now, thousands certainly isn't millions, but it's important to understand that just
That's
a
a lot.
small handful of people, they can cause a lot of problems.
Yeah,
Look
sure.
at this. The NYPD has identified 41 members of Tren de Aragua, this Venezuelan gang. But look at this. They've been busted nearly 150 times. Arrests are up 45% because of the presence of 41 people. And here's why that is. Look, they can recruit new members, which they're doing inside New
Why
York
would they
City
not do
shelter
that?
system. This is a gang of kids that live in the Roosevelt Hotel, a building that just so happens
I mean,
to
a
be
lot of those kids, to be fair, are cosplaying, right? Like they're not. I mean, these are like high school kids that are trying to act like gangsters, but some of them are causing problems.
the Welcome Center for Asylum Seekers in New York. So if you're an asylum seeker, you come to New York, the first place you go is infested by gang members who are recruiting. That's a great situation. If you're a criminal, and look at this, 10 of these guys were busted for selling weapons, the same types of weapons that these cartels are now bringing into our country. AR-15 assault rifles, modified handguns. And these weapons that the cartels are bringing into our country, they're being specifically used by the worst people who are in our country and shouldn't be here to grow their criminal operations. They need these weapons to coerce people to join their gangs. They need these weapons to push out rival gangs and exert their influence over territory, which they've invaded.
Once they commit their crimes, they go back to the migrant community where they assimilate themselves with people that are actually here obeying the laws.
The NYPD is cracking down on Tren de Aragua, the Venezuelan gang they say is living in the shelter system and recruiting children.
We have 39 members of TVA that have been identified, and we have an additional 4 members that have been identified of a subgroup called the Little Devils of 42nd Street.
42nd Street.
Yeah, those are much younger kids.
And those are just the members police have been able to...
So at the time of this report, the number of known gang members was just 39.
Bro, this is some gangs in New York shit. God damn.
People. 39 people is all it took to start growing a criminal empire inside New York City shelters, which are supposed to help people, but they don't do any vetting, and they don't let police inside. We're a sanctuary city, so these criminals, they just took these places over with weapons they're getting from these cartels.
Undocumented criminals as young as 11 years old are carrying out retail robberies and committing crimes on scooters.
11 years? Oh my God. They're getting them early.
Snatching people's jewelry, watches, and cell phones at gunpoint and knife point. Over 300 incidents last year, more than 800 so far this year. They brazenly...
Okay, so this is what a small handful of people does. And the NYPD, God bless them, but they don't have a clue how many of these gang members are out there. How can they when none of these people were properly vetted before being allowed in the first place? This gang is like a tree. You've got the branches that are sprouting out of the ground, but you have no idea how deep the roots actually
these kids are cosplaying? No,
Scouts
I'm
have found a
sure.
colonizable
All I'm
planet.
saying is, like, I don't think that like every single one is like that. Like, as somebody who went to like kind of like a lower like working class like school, there were kids that were like involved with gang stuff, and then there were also kids that like to pretend that they were involved in gang stuff. And I think anybody that went to, you know, a school like that can attest to that.
Oh, and
that's
how
all I'm
deep
saying.
This gang's tentacles are wrapped around the internal workings of the criminal underworld in our city. And it looks like there's a small army of criminals now operating in America, especially in some of our sanctuary cities. But in order to stop a small army of criminals from getting here and arming themselves, you've got to stop an army outside of America's border from doing the groundwork for all of this to happen.
Yeah,
something
obviously.
that they've been allowed to do for far too long.
And while this directive was just issued, officials in Texas have already been bracing for a fall. A few days ago, Lieutenant Christopher Oliveras with Texas DPS told News Nation that as enforcement wraps up, cartels will fight to protect their smuggling routes. So what's really interesting, Nicole, is I spent many years reporting on the southern border on the Mexican side.
So these cartels, they are so bad and so heavily armed. You've got to have an all-out response if you want to stop these guys. Just telling them not to come to the border or expecting that Mexico is going to be able to handle this on their own, that's ridiculous. Mexico hasn't been able to handle these guys on their own. That's why they're here in the first place. And look at this. They've even infiltrated U.S. law enforcement. A Customs and Border Patrol officer was just arrested for human smuggling. Apparently, he was in league with these cartels. And he was paid $2,500 for each person he brought into the country.
It's a bit of a fucking mistake,
President Trump, the borders they are not playing around. Not only are they deploying as much as they possibly can in the way of resources to the border, but they're doing internal investigations to root out those who are criminals and who are standing against an agenda that will keep our country safe and secure. But what do you think? Is the U.S. going to be able to put a stop to this? Or will
if they want to stop it, they can stop at 90%. You're never going to get rid of all of it, right? It's the same as like, I mean, you can never get rid of all of anything. But like in a general sense, you know, yeah, they can stop it.
Temporary in 4 years when we've got
they shut down
president.
A lot of it, at
is
least.
all of this going to change? Are the cartels just going to wait it out? Let me know. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video.
That was a good one. Yeah, I hadn't seen that before. I figured I wanted to watch it and see what's going on there. Germany almost did. Yeah, minimize it, bring in the vets in and pay them well. Yeah, I mean, again, I think that there's a lot of people that would probably love to be able to go after them and do that. But they did that in months. Yeah, there's the video right there.
Reporting in.
But yeah, W video. Yeah, I've watched a lot of Cash Jordan's videos. I think they're really good, actually. I'm a very big fan. And I think that he covers this topic pretty well.
We know that Balin's expedition to reclaim Moria ended in failure and death. But what actually happened, and why did he risk it? Did he ever even stand a chance? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel, we cover the best in fantasy books and TV shows. The Lord of the Rings, A Song of Ice and Fire, and The Witcher. If that sounds good to you, there's a subscribe button in the bottom right of your screen. One of the most moving moments in The Lord of the Rings is when Gimli learns the fate of Balin in Moria, weeping over his tomb. But what possessed Balin to attempt to retake Moria in the first place? And what happened? Was there ever a realistic chance that he could have succeeded? Balin is one of the first characters we are introduced to in The Hobbit. He was the second dwarf to bundle his way into Bag End for the unexpected party after his brother Dwalin, and from the beginning stands out from the other dwarves. He is older than most of them. At 178 years old, only Thorin of the company is older, and is described as being very old-looking, with a white beard. Clearly, Thorin, with his mostly still dark hair, has aged a bit better. In other words, Balin may not have been the oldest member of the company, but he looked it and acted it, and the others treated him with respect. He is often the dwarf chosen by Tolkien to show how the dwarves slowly warm to Bilbo. He's the one who first accepts the idea of Bilbo accompanying them, mistakenly thinking Bilbo is some kind of professional burglar. Actually helping Bilbo tidy up a bit after the dwarves descended, waiting for him outside the Green Dragon Inn, calling him good old Bilbo partway through their mission, walking with him, accompanying him partway into the Lonely Mountain when the rest of the dwarves held back, and so on. A few years after the story ended, he even journeyed with Gandalf to visit Bilbo in the Shire. I think Tolkien liked Balin, and wanted us to like him too. Balin, like many of the dwarves on the mission, was from royal stock. He was a distant cousin to Thorin, they shared a great-great-grandfather, and lived through most of the main events of dwarf history in the latter part of the Third Age. He was at Erebor, albeit just as a child, when Smaug attacked the Lonely Mountain, leading to their exile. He took part in the War of the Dwarves and Orcs after King Thror's death. In the final battle of that war, Balin's father, Fundin, was killed. He was part of King Thrain's escort when Thrain decided to look again upon the Lonely Mountain, but was captured en route by Sauron's forces. It was Balin and Dwalin who survived and took the news to Thorin, making him king. Then, years after that, he was Thorin's right-hand man on his quest of Erebor. In short, all of Balin's life had been about trying to reclaim those dwarven homelands that he had last been cast out of as a child. If we are looking for a reason why Balin attempted to retake Moria, I guess it is here. Balin wasn't young. At 226 years old by that time, he was considered old even by dwarf standards, and his entire life had been in exile of one kind or another. As a child, he had been forced from Erebor, but had helped to reclaim it years later. One thing remained. His father had been killed outside the gates of Moria, the true homeland of Durin's folk. If he was ever to right that wrong, it had to be now. The second reason why Balin thought he might try to retake Moria is probably because everything had been quiet there for a long time. The Balrog hadn't been seen or heard from. The Orcs of the Misty Mountains had been soundly defeated in the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, and then again in the Battle of the Five Armies. Sauron had been thrown from southern Mirkwood and was now amassing his forces in Mordor rather than northwest Middle-earth. The Great Goblin had been killed. Beorn and the Beornings were now patrolling the lands west of the Anduin. In Erebor, all was well. King Dain II had rebuilt it, Lake Town had been repaired, Dale refounded, strong relations with the men nearby had been forged. We may be able to look back and see that the seeds of war were being sown elsewhere, but to the dwarves, it must have felt that their luck had turned. They had spent so much of the Third Age being chased out of one homeland to the next, but now, finally, they had reclaimed Erebor and secured it. Had their luck turned? The place they most wanted, their spiritual home, was Khazad-dûm. Erebor was important, but it wasn't their true home. Khazad-dûm was, and all the signs from there were pretty good. No sight of the Balrog. The Orcs seemed weakened irrevocably. Balin was nearing the end of his days. Why not give it a try? Balin probably didn't think he would be able to walk in without some sort of a fight, and he got one. He set off with a medium-sized group of dwarves and overcame the Orcs at the East Gate before heading inside, apparently without much further resistance. It's hard to say whether Balin had expected this. He wasn't stupid, so I'm sure he knew that there would be more Orcs within, but as far as we can tell, they decided to avoid the dwarves in the short term. Given the size of Khazad-dûm, 40 miles from east to west, many miles north to south, and many, many levels up and down, this was not hard. Balin declared victory and established their base in the 21st Hall and his throne room in the Chamber of Mazarbul. He declared himself Lord of Moria. All seemed well. And it was for about 5 years. The colony's base was not far from the East Gate, but they ranged far and wide, discovering many of the ancient treasures they had been seeking for. Durin's axe and helm, the armory and mithril depository. But although this was branded as a colony, dwarves reproduce slowly, and in 5 years, the original group was still roughly the same size. At which point Balin, perhaps starting to relax a bit, the Orcs weren't as great a threat as he'd feared, and the Balrog was still nowhere to be seen, went to see the Mirrormere. The Mirrormere is a lake just outside the East Gate of Moria. It has a huge religious importance for the dwarves. It's where the first Durin, after whom Durin's folk were named, gazed into the waters and saw a crown of stars reflected over his head and decided that this was where he should stop his wandering and build a homeland for his people. You may remember in the books Gimli pausing there during the Fellowship's escape from Moria. It was so important to him and his people that he couldn't pass without pausing to reflect on it, no matter how many Orcs were chasing after them. Anyway, Balin went out to the Mirrormere and was tragically shot by an Orc archer. He probably never even saw the orc who killed him. The dwarves carried him back into Khazad-dûm and gave him a burial in a tomb fit for a lord of Moria, in the chamber he had used as his throne room. And very soon, the dwarves realized that this was not a one-off. The orcs were advancing irrevocably from the east. The east gate fell, and the dwarves fought a desperate rearguard action, room by room, chamber by chamber. We read of an epic and strategically important battle in the second chamber. The first chamber was just inside the east door. Then came the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, which was designed as a defensive structure. You could only cross over it one at a time, so a small defensive unit could defend it much more easily against a superior invading force. The orcs threw themselves over the bridge in overwhelming numbers. The dwarves fought bravely and surely killed many orcs for each of them, but the numbers told. The dwarves had to abandon their best defensive position and let the orcs in. As a side note here, Balin had brought with him two of the other dwarves we know of from The Hobbit, Oin and Ori. Ori was the records keeper. It is his account of what happened next that the Fellowship find and that tells us the gruesome details. The remaining dwarves clearly decided that the odds were now overwhelmingly against them, and Oin was dispatched westwards with a small group of dwarves to see whether the remaining colonists could escape that way. He made it as far as the West Gate, Durin's Gate. You'll remember the Fellowship being stuck outside it in The Lord of the Rings. Oin discovered that the waters outside had now reached as far as the gate itself. He ventured outside, and the Watcher in the waters killed him, and several of his companions. 4 made it back to the last few dwarven colonists. The east gate was held by the orcs, and now they knew that the west gate was also close to them. They were trapped. As another side note, there was not usually a lake outside the west gate of Moria. It seems that the orcs dammed the river Ciranon and flooded the area so that the Watcher in the water could come right up to the west gate. This wasn't just a random attack from the orcs. They planned this and deliberately blocked the west gate before attacking the east gate. The dwarves were trapped before they even knew it. And then the orcs attacked. The dwarves holed themselves up in Balin's throne room and no doubt took out many orcs before their own doom. Years later, Gandalf read Ori's final record, telling of the final moment as the orcs prepared to attack. Drums, drums in the deep was not just a cool line, it was a record of the orcs' final battle preparations. And so ended Balin's attempt to reclaim his people's homeland of Khazad-dûm. Perhaps, though, we might draw a small, thin line of hope from that hopeless mission. The reason Gimli and co. went to Rivendell and were there for the Council of Elrond was to seek information on what had happened to Balin, that and to report on the visit of Sauron's emissary to Erebor. The fellowship that emerged from that council ultimately led to the destruction of the Balrog, and with Sauron's demise, the end of the orcs in Middle-earth. Ultimately, without Balin and co. knocking on Bilbo's door decades earlier, and Balin himself personally befriending Bilbo on the quest of Erebor, Bilbo would not have found the ring, and the ring would not have been destroyed. And years later, the dwarves did reclaim Moria. Durin the Seventh led a group back there in the Fourth Age, and this time it was successful. Balin had the right idea, but perhaps just a couple of centuries too early. If you'd like more videos about the world of Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, please click on the link on the left of your screen now. For my new channel, IDG Live, please click on the link in the middle of your screen. Or to support this channel, my Patreon link is on the right-hand side. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.
Mining upgrade complete.
Tolkien told us that Morgoth had a ring of sorts, like Sauron had a ring of power. It was clearly very important in Tolkien's world, but what was Morgoth's ring? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel we dive deep into Tolkien's legendarium, as well as other great fantasy worlds like A Song of Ice and Fire and The Witcher. If you like the sound of that, there's a subscribe button in the bottom right of the screen. There are many important rings throughout Tolkien's legendarium, most notably the One Ring and the Rings of Power, of course. But what about Morgoth's ring? Morgoth, or Melkor, was the original big baddie in Tolkien's Legendarium, and one of the volumes of Christopher Tolkien's epic History of Middle-earth series was called Morgoth's Ring. So what was it, and what relation did it have to Sauron's ring? Well, when you dig into it, you'll find that Morgoth's ring is actually one of the foundational ideas or concepts in Tolkien's whole creation, and to understand it, it's perhaps best to start with this quote from one of Tolkien's essays. Just as Sauron concentrated his power in the One Ring, Morgoth dispersed his power into the very matter of Arda. Thus, the whole of Middle-earth was Morgoth's ring. So Tolkien wants us to link the two, Morgoth's ring and Sauron's ring. Let's start with Sauron, as we already have an instinctive understanding of what he did there. In creating the One Ring, he poured much of his will and power into it, concentrating it into that one ring. So it contained, in concentrated form, his essence, his life strength. There's a lot of different words we could use to describe it, but as we know, the impact was that when he wore it, he became that much stronger. When he didn't have it, he was weaker, and when it was destroyed, then so would he be, or at least he would lose his ability to have a physical form. Now, Sauron doesn't seem to have come up with this idea all by himself. For thousands of years, he had been the chief lieutenant of Morgoth, and undoubtedly learned much from him. In particular, he seemingly learned about what we might think of as ring magic, but it was probably more accurately magic in which you put a part of yourself, your power or soul as it were, into something inanimate. So what did Morgoth put a part of his power into? Well, to go back to that quote from Tolkien, the whole of Middle-earth was Morgoth's ring. Impressive, but what does that mean? Tolkien went on to explain what Morgoth had done like this. A vaster, more perilous procedure, though of similar sort to the operation of Sauron with the rings. Thus, outside of the Blessed Realm, all matter was likely to have a Melkor ingredient, as it were a tendency, small or great, towards Melkor. They were none of them wholly free of him in their incarnate form, and their bodies had an effect upon their spirits. So Melkor, Morgoth, thus put a part of himself into everything, not just Middle-earth, incidentally, but all of creation. As with Sauron and his ring, this therefore tied his fate to that of creation, and made creation, at least partly, reflective of him. It was no longer this perfect creation brought forth by Eru Ilúvatar and sung forth by the Ainur. It all had this tendency, in Tolkien's language, towards him and his rebellion. In typical Tolkien fashion, he had a name for this idea. Arda Mard. This is the in-universe term for the fallen world. Morgoth is in many ways an analogue for Satan in Christian theology, the great enemy who rebelled, and his fall caused others to fall, and ultimately the whole world fell. We see this symbolically as well as practically at the start of the Silmarillion, when Morgoth, or Melkor as he was then known, sings notes of discord during the music of the Ainur. This tarnished Eru's original design, which then fed into the actual creation. Eru honoured the music the Ainur created, imperfections and all, and Arda was marred from the start. But even then, it might not have been as marred as it later became. Other beings joined Melkor in his rebellion inside this new creation. Maiar like Sauron and the Belrogs at first, and later much of mankind. Even if Melkor were reformed, or cast out of Ea entirely, these other creatures could continue to perpetuate evil. And with Morgoth pouring the greater part of his primeval spiritual potential into all the matter of the world, Arda was well and truly marred. Morgoth's discordant notes may have been the catalyst for all of this, but the fallen world would remain fallen even without him, as Finrod says. Even if Melkor could in any way be thrown down or cast from Arda, still his shadow would remain, and the evil that he has wrought and sown as a seed would wax and multiply. The comparison between Sauron's ring and what Morgoth accomplished was not merely analogous, it was the same process, albeit on different scales, because Melkor was, in his beginning, far more powerful, but there was a crucial difference. Tolkien writes that Sauron's relatively smaller power was concentrated, Morgoth's vast power was disseminated. the whole of Middle-earth was Morgoth's ring, Sauron's power was not, for example, in gold as such, but in a particular form or shape of a particular portion of total gold. Morgoth's power was disseminated throughout gold, if nowhere absolute, for he did not create gold, it was nowhere absent. Sauron was less powerful, but pushed his power into just one small thing. Morgoth was infinitely more powerful, but pushed his power everywhere, which actually helped Sauron, because he could use what Morgoth had already done. We read, Sauron, however, inherited the corruption of Arda, and only spent his much more limited power on the rings. It was this Morgoth element in matter, indeed, which was a prerequisite for such magic and other evils as Sauron practiced with it and upon it. Because of what Morgoth did, all of Arda, Middle-earth, was marred or fallen. That empowered Sauron to do what he did. As an aside, if you've ever read tales of the first age of Middle-earth and wondered how Morgoth in his physical form was capable of being matched sometimes in combat with much lesser beings, it's because of this dissemination of his power. He wasn't the being he once was. Indeed, it's likely that Sauron, with all his power concentrated in that one ring, was eventually mightier than Morgoth, with all his power spread out across the entire world. And there is one more crucial implication of the difference in scale of Morgoth and Sauron's rings. Though Frodo might disagree, destroying Sauron's ring was actually relatively straightforward, just dropping it into the Crowds of Doom. I said relatively straightforward, though, because consider what it would take to destroy Morgoth's ring. Tolkien put it quite bluntly. The final eradication of Sauron was achievable by the destruction of the ring. No such eradication of Morgoth was possible, since this required the complete disintegration of the matter of Arda.
How can I be of service?
Morgoth could only ultimately be defeated by destroying the whole world. Obviously, this was not an option for the Valar. Perhaps it could have been before the elves awoke, but not after, unless you wanted to kill them too. Now, I've talked so far about Morgoth pouring his power into everything, and all of Arda was marred by the creation of his ring, but that isn't to say that it was spread evenly. Some parts of creation were more deeply affected than others. For example, gold in Middle-earth seems to always have a more evil tendency than other precious metals, or more accurately, it seems to readily prompt greed and other undesirable traits. Dragon sickness, an obsession with and love for gold, was a real thing in Middle-earth. On the other hand, Aman, the Undying Lands, were much less affected by Morgoth's ring than other parts of the world, which is as you'd expect. But this isn't to say that they were not affected at all. When Miriel gave birth to Feanor, Feanor's life force was so strong that Miriel never recovered and voluntarily died, going to the halls of Mandos. This was not just a tragedy for the elves, but against the very nature of how a man should work, because a small bit of Arda Mard had crept in. What hope is there then, if nowhere in Air, not even the Blessed Realm, is wholly free of Morgoth, even long after he was thrust out into the abyss? When Finrod realized this, he was initially dismayed. Finrod, however, sees now that, as things were, no created thing or being in Arda or in all Air was powerful enough to counteract or heal evil, that is, to subdue Melkor in his present person, reduced though that was, and the evil that he had dissipated and sent out from himself into the very structure of the world. It is for this reason that the elves concluded that the end of Arda would have to be catastrophic, as the only solution would be to destroy Morgoth's ring even more totally than Sauron's, melting down all the atoms and elements everywhere. That would be necessary to achieve Arda healed, a world like Arda unmarred, in that it would not be stained with the shadow of Melkor, but better. The elves weren't sure whether this new world at the end of time would be the same world put back together but cleared of Morgoth's influence, or a completely new world, but it didn't really matter. What matters is that this is when they would see creation as Eru Iluvatar intended, perfect and unmarred. Despite being the big baddie of Tolkien's Legendarium, the narrative does not always convey to the casual reader the extent of Melkor's threat, because we see him mostly after he has created his ring and disseminated his power into the world. We see Morgoth wrestled by Tulkas, crippled by Fingolfin, lulled by Luthien, and defeated not by Manwë, but merely his herald, Eonwë. In that light, he seems of a kind with other big baddies. But he isn't. Not by a long way. Morgoth is not merely different in degree, but in kind. He is not just more evil than another baddie. He is the originator of evil. Moreover, every subsequent evil is not simply a consequence of his original sin, but actively the result of his spirit still poisoning everything and everyone everywhere. Even Sauron's One Ring is simply part of Morgoth's ring. It's Morgul magic working because Morgoth's spirit made such sorcery possible. Years after Sauron was defeated, other Dark Lords would rise because all of Middle-earth was marred. Every time Frodo contended with the temptation to wear the One Ring, he was contending with Morgoth, no less than Sauron. Morgoth, who marred Arda, making the dark magic of the ring work. Which is all a bit depressing, really. Evil may be defeated, but it will always spring back somewhere else. Where is the hope that Tolkien always brings us? It's in the hope that the elves had of Arda healed. When Morgoth is finally defeated, that defeat will bring the world as it should have been. And this adds another layer to the story that we know in The Lord of the Rings. Destroying Sauron's ring and ending his rule is not merely a short-term defeat for evil, only for it to rise again elsewhere. It is foreshadowing of that greater victory at the end of time when Morgoth's ring shall be destroyed. At the end of all things, Sam asked, "Is everything sad going to come untrue?"
All hands.
No, it wasn't. Not then. But it will. When Morgoth's ring is destroyed, Tolkien paints a picture of Arda healed in which everything sad really does come untrue. That is the true end of Tolkien's Legendarium, the ultimate downfall of the Lord of the Ring, Morgoth's ring, and the return of the king, of which the other was but a glimpse. If you'd like more videos diving deep into Tolkien's Legendarium, please click on the playlist on the left of your screen. Or to support this channel, the best way to do that is through Patreon, the link on the right of your screen. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.
Just a short detour while we clear a path. Our fleet is under attack. This should be a routine combat mission. Hold tight. This'll only take a minute.
The Silmarillion is at the heart of Tolkien's Legendarium, but what is actually in there? Let's take a look. Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel we cover Tolkien's Legendarium in nerdy detail, as well as A Song of Ice and Fire and... If you're new here, welcome. The Silmarillion is a collection of J.R.R. Tolkien's writings on Middle-earth, edited by Christopher Tolkien, with help from Guy Gavriel Kay and published after his death. It acts as a history of Middle-earth, from its creation through to the time and just after the events of The Lord of the Rings. It had been something Tolkien had wanted to publish during his lifetime, trying and failing to persuade his publishers to release it alongside The Lord of the Rings. But as he never finished a final version of it, and carried on amending and revising his creation right up to his death, Christopher Tolkien was left with an unenviable task in pulling it all together. While it is undeniably J.R.R. Tolkien's work, Christopher had to make a number of significant decisions about which version of his father's work to include, and in some cases even had to finish off some stories within it. Nevertheless, the Silmarillion is viewed as authoritative within the Legendarium. It's written in a more formal, old-fashioned style than the two main Tolkien books we know, lending it a slightly more biblical feel, if that's the right word, and the combination of a narrative spanning millennia with hundreds of characters with often similar sounding names and even the basic geography of the planet changing several times, many people don't find it an easy read. So don't worry if you have tried it and found it hard going, you're in good company. Okay, preamble out of the way, what is in the book? It's made up of 5 parts, so let's go through them in turn. The first part is called the Ainulindale, the music of the Ainur. This is an account of the creation of the world by Eru, Ilúvatar, the one true god. He first made the Ainur powerful spiritual beings who he taught to sing and led them in a great song that through Eru's flame imperishable they could see. This was beautiful but got disrupted by Melkor, who was later known as Morgoth, who sang discordant notes, even when Eru stopped and started the singing again a couple of times. Morgoth becomes the great enemy throughout the Silmarillion. He is hugely powerful, but jealous of Eru's ability to create things ex nihilo, and therefore wants to disrupt it. Anyway, Eru then showed the Ainur what it was that they were singing, basically the history of the world. He then created it, and many of the Ainur went down into this newly formed world. They became known as the Valar and Maiar. More about that in a moment. And were commissioned by Eru to form and prepare the world for the later coming of the children of Ilúvatar. That's elves and humans. Of course, Morgoth also descended into the world to oppose this, and there were a couple of massive wars, but eventually the world was set ready for the arrival of the elves, while an uneasy peace held between the Valar and Morgoth. The second part of the book is the Valaquenta, account of the Valar and Maiar, according to the lore of the Eldar. In this section, we pause the run through history and instead take a moment to explain who these powerful spiritual beings are that are now in charge of Arda, that's the world. I'll cover this in more depth in another video, but basically there are the 14 Valar, the most powerful of the beings, each of which has a special interest and powers in a particular area. For example, Ulmo is the Lord of Waters and King of the Sea. Yavanna is Queen of Earth, responsible for all things that grow. Their leader and King of the Valar is Manwë. It's worth noting that although these Valar have godlike powers and were there when Eru showed them the vision of the history of the world, they are neither omnipotent nor omniscient. They can see parts of the plan for the future in a hazy way, but not all of it. And although they are on the side of Eru and goodness and light, they are also not perfect. If you imagine a more rarefied version of the Norse or Greek pantheon of gods, you're not far off. Less powerful, but still immortal spiritual beings are the Maiar. They support and assist the Valar in their duties. We don't know the names of all of them, but we do meet some of them in The Lord of the Rings. Gandalf, Saruman and Sauron, for example. Which brings us to the enemies. We've already mentioned Morgoth, who is basically an evil Valar, but as he fell, he brought with him several Maiar. Sauron, of course, but also the Balrogs. So, after the first two sections of the book, the scene is set for when the action really kicks in part 3, Quenta Silmarillion, the history of the Silmarils. This is easily the largest part of the whole book, and its focus. It starts with the wars between Morgoth and the Valar. There's a lot of toing and froing here, giant lamps getting knocked over, continents shattered and so on, but we end up with two important continents, Aman to the west where the Valar are, and Middle-earth where Morgoth has his home, and it is on Middle-earth where the elves awaken. This prompts the Valar back into action. They launch another war on Morgoth, and this time capture him, imprisoning him for 3 ages. Meanwhile, the Valar invite the elves to journey over to Aman to live with them. Many of them do, but some decide to stay where they are, and some decide to stop on the way. It's the start of many divisions between different types of elves. Anyway, many of the elves are now over in Aman and living in some kind of harmony, with light now being provided by 2 holy trees. All is well until Morgoth's imprisonment comes to an end. For a time he pretends to be a reformed character, but his covetous eyes fall on the 3 Silmarils. The Silmarils are important for this part of the story, hence the book being called the Silmarillion. They are jewels crafted by an elf named Fëanor that capture the holy light of those 2 trees of Valinor. Morgoth steals the jewels, and while he's at it, destroys the 2 trees of Valinor with the help of Ungoliant, a horrific spider-like light-eating monster. Morgoth makes his way back to his fortress in northern Middle-earth, leaving Valinor in darkness. Fëanor, who made the Silmarils, leads his people over there en masse to try and reclaim the jewels. In so doing, he makes his sons swear an oath not to rest until the Silmarils are back in their possession. It is a fateful oath, as we'll see. Fëanor himself doesn't get the Silmarils back. He rather rashly rushes ahead of his army and gets ambushed by some Balrogs. Ouch. But his sons and their people, the Noldor elves, have also arrived in Middle-earth and find that the elves they left behind there have now established kingdoms and civilizations, and not long after that, they discover that the second-born children of Ilúvatar, humans, have awakened and are spreading to the west. This is now what we know of as the First Age of Middle-earth. For a few hundred years, there was a sort of loose siege of Morgoth's fortress while he was, unknown to the outside world, building up his armies with new and horrific creations. This is when he first made dragons, for example. But finally Morgoth broke out, and region by region, stronghold by stronghold, the elves and humans fell before him. Indeed, many of the humans were corrupted onto his side. Eventually, Eärendil the sailor sailed for Aman to beg the intervention of the Valar. Against all hope, the Valar responded, coming in force to defeat Morgoth once more. That part of Middle-earth was sunk beneath the sea in the destruction, Morgoth captured and flung into the void, though some of his lieutenants, like Sauron, escaped. We can't talk about the First Age, though, without mentioning the three great tales Tolkien wove in there. Beren and Luthien is the epic love story of a man, Beren, and an elf, Luthien, who fell in love but were barred from marrying by Luthien's father, unless Beren could recover one of the Silmarils, which by this point were set into Morgoth's Iron Crown. Many adventures and much heroism followed before they managed it, though tragedy was to follow, as first some dwarves lusted after the Silmaril and committed atrocities to get it. Then Fëanor's sons, who had sworn that oath, remember, committed more atrocities in trying to get it themselves. The Children of Húrin is another tragedy, telling the story of Turin Turambar and his sister Nienor, whose cursed fates entwine. It is perhaps Tolkien's bleakest work. Then The Fall of Gondolin tells the tale of the fall of the last great secret stronghold to Morgoth's forces. In case you are wondering about the fate of the Silmarils themselves, whose theft had led to all these events, the one Beren and Luthien took ended up with their descendant Eärendil, who himself ended up in the night sky, a light offering hope to all. The other two were eventually claimed by Fëanor's sons, though not for long. The ill deeds they had done caused the holy light within the Silmarils to burn their hands. One was flung into the fiery depths of the earth, the other into the sea. So that's the third part of the book. As I said, it's the biggest, so I've skated over quite a lot of detail there. Part 4 is Akallabeth, the downfall of Númenor. The story of the Second Age, in other words. After the tumultuous end to the First Age, the world was reshaped again, and a new island continent given to the descendants of the humans who fought against Morgoth. Númenor grew to be powerful, the height of human civilization, but also slowly turned against the elves and the Valar. They grew jealous of the elves' immortality. Some remained true, faithful, but most didn't. Meanwhile, Sauron emerged, challenging their power, but unexpectedly, he surrendered to them and allowed himself to be taken off to Númenor as a captive. From there, he slowly worked his way into the good graces of the king, Ar-Pharazôn, and fanned the flames of rebellion against the Valar themselves. They build a mighty fleet to invade the Undying Lands, but as soon as they land there, Eru himself intervenes, destroying the fleet and army and sinking Númenor back beneath the waves. Just the few faithful, led by Elendil, survive to form two new kingdoms in Middle-earth, Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south. Which brings us to the final part of the book, part 5, of the Rings of Power and the Third Age. This tells the familiar history of the forging of the Rings of Power, their distribution, the last alliance of elves and men, Sauron's defeat and Isildur's fall, the opening sequence of the Fellowship of the Ring film, basically, and it brings the story up to date, right up to the end of the story of the Lord of the Rings. So that's the Silmarillion, a background and history to the Lord of the Rings. Although, from Tolkien's perspective, it was really the other way around. The Lord of the Rings was an offshoot of this much greater work. The legendarium presented in the Silmarillion is a work of decades, a lifetime. As Tolkien himself said in a letter to his publishers, his aim had always initially been to create a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story. The larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendour from the vast backcloths. If The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are the romantic fairy stories, then the Silmarillion is the vast backcloth from which they draw their splendour. If you'd like more videos diving deep into Tolkien's Legendarium, there's a playlist appearing now on the left of your screen. Or if you'd like to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon page on the right of the screen. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.
An auction is underway.
All hands, prepare for phase jump. Military structure complete. You've made a fine purchase.
Did you know that, according to Tolkien, Gandalf, Saruman and the rest of the Astari had an earlier mission to Middle-earth that they seem to have all forgotten about? Really? Let's take a look. Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel we dive deep into Tolkien's lore and Legendarium. If you're new here, welcome. When Gandalf, Saruman and the other Astari arrived in Middle-earth around the year 1000 of the Third Age, it was to help the free peoples of Middle-earth in opposing Sauron. And most of us have always assumed that it is the first time these five were there. But when you read the account of what happened in Unfinished Tales, there's a surprising hint that perhaps it's not. We're told that these five Maiar were clad in bodies as of men, real and not feigned, but subject to the fears and pains and weariness of earth, able to hunger and thirst and be slain, though because of their noble spirits they did not die, and aged only by the cares and labour of many long years. And this the Valar did, desiring to amend the errors of old, especially that they had attempted to guard and seclude the Eldar by their own might and glory fully revealed, whereas now their emissaries were forbidden to reveal themselves in forms of majesty, or to seek to rule the wills of men or elves by open display of power, but coming in shapes weak and humble, were bidden to advise and persuade men and elves to good, and to seek to unite in love and understanding all those whom Sauron, should he come again, would endeavour to dominate and corrupt. So, the decision to send the Astari as old men there to advise and help rather than in full power wasn't just a random wise decision. It was an attempt, in Tolkien's words, to amend the errors of old, when they had tried to protect the elves with their full power on show. So, what happened back then? And when? And why was it an error? And who exactly were these emissaries? Lots of questions, and it's always been a bit of a mystery in Tolkien circles. We have some hints, and people have speculated, of course, but it is only with the publication of The Nature of Middle-earth last year, a collection of largely previously unreleased notes from the great man, edited by Carl Hostetter, that we got a full answer. In particular, we get to see some timelines that Tolkien wrote out over the course of several months in 1959. That's a few years after the publication of The Lord of the Rings, although, as we'll see, there's evidence to suggest that this had been on Tolkien's mind for a while. So, what is this earlier mission, and how did it go so wrong? To answer this, we need to go way back in time to when the elves first awakened in Middle-earth. Tolkien gives us a lot of background and history as to how everything ended up like this, but basically, when they awoke, the Valar were no longer living in Middle-earth, and were instead on their new continent of Aman, just visiting Middle-earth occasionally. Someone, however, who was very much in Middle-earth was Morgoth. So when the elves awakened, entirely innocent in the world, they were in immediate danger, and the Valar weren't there to protect them. However, in an annal chronicling the awakening of the first 144 elves at Cuiviénen, we learned that the Maiar Melian, having been warned in a dream, leaves Valinor and goes to Middle-earth. When there, she finds and sets herself up with these newly formed elves and presumably protects them from being wiped out completely by Morgoth. She remains there with them for perhaps a couple of thousand years. Incidentally, for those well versed in the Silmarillion, yes, this is the same Melian who later entranced and married King Thingol the Elf, protected Doriath with her magic, and from whom so many great heroes descended: Luthien, Elwyn, Elrond, Elros. It all ties in, and perhaps even softens some of the harsher elements of the story we already know. For example, She and Thingol almost certainly knew each other, and perhaps even cared for each other for a long time before she entranced him with magic, forcing his people to search so long and hard for him. It wasn't just a random meeting in the woods, as it sometimes can seem in the Silmarillion. Anyway, eventually, Orome the Valar also stumbles across the elves, stays with them for a few years, and heads back to the rest of the Valar to decide what to do with them. This is quite a tricky decision for the Valar. They want to protect the elves from Morgoth, but know that another war with him would devastate the land. They want to bring the elves to the safety of Aman, but respect that Aru put them in Middle-earth. Eventually, they settle on a plan to strongly invite, but not compel, the elves to come over to their land. There's a bit of toing and froing, with 3 elven emissaries heading west first to check out this new land, and in the meantime, the elves needed protecting. So we read this. The Valar send 5 guardians, great spirits of the Maiar. With Melian, the only woman but the chief, these make 6. The others were Tarindor, later Saruman, Alorin, Gandalf, Ravandil, Radagast, Palasendo, and Hymenor. Are Palasendo and Hymenor the later Blue Wizards? It seems likely, given that the other guardians are the other 3 Astari. And linguistically, Palasendo means far-sighted one, an echo perhaps of Palando, one of the Blue Wizards. And Hymenor, Alatar sound similar-ish. We don't know for sure, but we do know that Saruman, Gandalf, and Radagast were there. And they were not as the old men we would recognise, but as great spirits of the Maiar, in full power, in other words. And as far as we can tell, they did their job. The elves were protected and Morgoth resisted in the main. But to return to the main narrative here, Orome's return with these powerful guardian spirits actually provoked some rather heretical thoughts among the elves. Some began to believe that, although the Valar clearly do exist, they have abandoned Middle-earth. Rightly, as the appointed realm of the Quendi. Now they are becoming jealous and wish to control the Quendi as vassals, and so repossess themselves of Middle-earth. Finwë, a gallant and adventurous young Quende, direct descendant of Tata, is much taken by these ideas. Less so is his friend Elwë, descendant of Enel. For those keeping track, the rebellious Finwë here is the father of the much later rebellious Fëanor, and Elwë, the conformist, is the elf who later marries Melian the Maiar. So the Valar sending clearly very powerful Maiar guardians, Gandalf, Saruman and so on, to protect the elves, actually didn't really reassure the elves of the Valar's good intentions. Quite the opposite, in fact. A significant number grew suspicious and resentful. What happened next? Well, the Valar pushed their invite hard, and most of the elves set off westwards. Some don't, however, staying where they are, and some of those who did start out on the journey stopped on the way. Some of those who made it all the way decided to actually stay on an island just off the coast of Aman. Some of those who did make it all the way to the mainland and settled in Aman later rebelled and headed back, led by Fëanor, the seeds of which Tolkien tells us were planted with the earlier murmurings against the Valar and the Maiar. And at some stage, those 5 trusted, powerful Maiar were stood down from their role and returned to whatever they had been doing before in Aman. And time passed. Millennia later, when the Valar decided once more that they wished to help the free peoples of Middle-earth, sending emissaries to aid in the opposition to Sauron, they seemingly remembered who they had sent before and chose to send them again. But to return to that point we started with, the Valar decided to send them not in full power like last time, but as old men. Why? Because they were desiring to amend the errors of old, especially that they had attempted to guard and seclude the Eldar by their own might and glory fully revealed. The Valar had learned their lesson from the first time around. Gandalf, Saruman and co. had been in Middle-earth with their might and glory fully revealed. There are hints that perhaps they, maybe Saruman, had used that power imbalance with the elves to try to force them into doing things. The invitation to leave the only home they'd known and head en masse to Aman was a show of power and might. Did it make the elves wonder if they really did have a choice? And the result was rebellion. Some refused the Valar's wishes, some seemingly set off grudgingly and stopped on the way. One fell head over heels in love with one of the Maya when she used her power and stayed in Middle-earth with his people. The seeds of discontent lingered right through to Feanor's rebellion. All in all, not what the Valar had intended. So when they sent those Maiar back to Middle-earth in the Third Age, they tried a different approach. Support, advice and encouragement, clothed in shapes weak and humble. At least, that was the idea. But why did I call this a forgotten mission? Because for the Astari themselves, it was. We're told that being embodied, the Astari had needs to learn much anew by slow experience, and though they knew whence they came, the memory of the Blessed Realm was to them a vision from afar off, for which, so long as they remained true to their original mission, they yearned exceedingly. Gandalf twice says that he has forgotten his life before this mission, other than that yearning to return. Although this extra bit of history for Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast and probably the Blue Wizards was written after The Lord of the Rings was published, and after he had written the essay on the Astari and Unfinished Tales, it doesn't contradict anything there. Indeed, it seems to fill in a few gaps, as if Tolkien had this in the back of his mind all along, but only fleshed it out on paper later. I've already mentioned how this hints that Thingol very probably knew and liked Melian before she entranced him, so perhaps that was just a part of their romance, rather than the start of it. It also explains why we're told that Manwë wanted Alorin Gandalf to go on the mission in the Third Age, because Alorin was a lover of the Eldar that remained. Remained here could mean a number of things, but the context suggests that Gandalf loved those elves who remained in Middle-earth, which makes so much more sense if he had spent all that time with them. And this adds another layer to that wonderful interaction we have between Círdan and Gandalf, when Gandalf arrived in Middle-earth in the Third Age. Círdan chose to give the Ring of Power Narya to Gandalf, not the mightiest or the leader of the Astari. Why? Well, yes, Círdan was gifted with foresight and wisdom, but also he probably met all those Astari before on their first mission. In fact, Círdan is the only remaining elf we know to have been there. And if he had met Gandalf then, even if Gandalf had forgotten about it, Círdan may well have remembered Alorin as the single wisest of all the Maiar. And here he was again. Who better to give the ring that might rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill? But perhaps the most significant implication here is not just that, as is so often the case with Tolkien, humility and wisdom are greater than power and might, but getting things wrong and putting them right the next time, like the Valar did here, is understandable and worthy, because this time it works. The Valar's emissaries, well, Gandalf, succeed in winning the trust of the elves and the other free peoples of Middle-earth with ears to hear. Evil is defeated, and the elves, invited, not pressured, finally leave Middle-earth. The errors of old were amended and made whole. If you'd like to see more videos like this, diving deep into Tolkien's Legendarium, there's a playlist appearing now on the left of your screen. Or to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon page on the right of your screen. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.
A sound plan. Calculating jump coordinates.
We know that Gandalf is an immortal Maya, but did the Fellowship? Did they know quite how powerful he was, or that technically he couldn't actually die? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. On this channel we dive deep into Tolkien's Legendarium, as well as other great fantasy worlds like A Song of Ice and Fire and The Witcher. Welcome. When Gandalf and the rest of the Astari came to Middle-earth around the year 1000 of the Third Age, they came in disguise. All five were Maiar, basically angelic, eternal spirit beings of great power, but they came disguised as old men, with a limit on their powers and without great fanfare, just arriving quietly by boat on the west coast of Middle-earth. So when normal mortals in Middle-earth encountered them, they just assumed they were what they seemed to be, long-lived humans who had studied long and hard for their wisdom and abilities. Remember, at that time some men were extremely long-lived, Elendil, to take one example, was 322 years old when he died fighting Sauron, so presumably he would have lived even longer than that. But eventually it became apparent even to humans that these Istari were living too long and were too unchanging to be any kind of actual human, so most assumed that they were instead elves of some kind, and they even named them as such. Gandalf, the name that he became known by among many humans, literally means elf with the staff or wand. It's basically just a description of who they thought he was. And as we've noted in other videos, Gandalf didn't really flaunt his greater powers as he went around as Gandalf the Grey. It was all very low-key, nothing to prompt people to think that he was a more powerful being than he was. Also, we should probably add, in the interests of in-world immersion, most uneducated humans and probably some other races in Middle-earth weren't all that well versed in the taxonomies of different legendary types of being, and those that might take an interest would have no reason to think that a long-lived, powerful being necessarily came from Valinor, say, because there were plenty of long-lived, powerful beings already in Middle-earth, many of whose origins were unclear to most people. Tom Bombadil and Goldberry, say, the Watcher in the Water, Shelob, Ents, Ringwraiths, and so on. A long-lived old man who knew some magic was not actually that peculiar in Middle-earth. All that said, Tolkien did write in a 1954 essay that some people did know exactly what kind of being Gandalf was. He wrote, "The order of wizards was quite distinct from the wizards and magicians of later legend. They belonged solely to the Third Age and then departed, and none, save maybe Elrond, Círdan and Galadriel, discovered of what kind they were, or whence they came." We get a further clarification in the Silmarillion that afterwards it was said among the elves that they were messengers sent by the Lords of the West to contest the power of Sauron, if he should arise again, and to move elves and men and all living things of goodwill to valiant deeds. Which, I suppose, could end the discussion. Those three elves knew that Gandalf was a Maya, and no one else did at the time, including the Fellowship. Círdan saw them arrive, and Gandalf himself told Elrond and Galadriel. And afterwards, some of the elves figured some of it out. But I think there are more layers to this that it's worth digging into. For one, I suspect that Tolkien would later have added Glorfindel, at least, to that short list of three. The exact nature and history of Glorfindel was actually something Tolkien was developing right into the last year of his life, but he too was, in his own way, an emissary from the Valar to help the peoples of Middle-earth. And I think we need to nuance a bit the idea that, although people may not have known he was a Maya, some may well have figured out that he was more powerful than he appeared, or was from Valinor and was an emissary of some kind from the Valar, particularly as the story of the Lord of the Rings played out. Gandalf returning from the dead, and the upgrade in powers he displayed afterwards were pretty big clues, even if he resisted explaining in much detail the mechanics of what happened. So let's take a look at the Fellowship, and start with probably the most straightforward part of the answer, the hobbits. They obviously knew that Gandalf was a wizard to start with, and also long-lived, but that's probably about it. In fact, there's little reason to think that hobbits even knew what Maiar were, or thought much about what Gandalf might be beyond the obvious. Pippin only seems to really engage his brain on the matter when he and Gandalf arrive in Minas Tirith. He thinks this: Denethor looked indeed much more like a great wizard than Gandalf did, more kingly, beautiful and powerful, and older. Yet, by a sense other than sight, Pippin perceived that Gandalf had the greater power and the deeper wisdom, and a majesty that was veiled. And he was older, far older. How much older, he wondered. And then he thought how odd it was that he had never thought about it before. Treebeard had said something about wizards, but even then he had not thought of Gandalf as one of them. What was Gandalf? In what far time and place did he come into the world, and when would he leave it? Pippin doesn't come to a conclusion then, but it's apparent that he didn't know exactly what kind of being Gandalf was. There's no reason to think that Merry or Sam would be any different. Frodo is closer to Gandalf, and obviously Bilbo taught him a lot, but he didn't really have access to books of lore that might explain things until he retired to Rivendell, so maybe he figured something out and told Frodo, but probably none of the hobbits really knew much. Boromir didn't know Gandalf very well at all. Gandalf did visit Minas Tirith while Boromir was younger, as Faramir recalls when talking to Frodo. Indeed, Faramir remembers Gandalf mentioning that Alorin I was in my youth in the West that is forgotten. Alorin is, of course, the name Gandalf had back in Valinor. When Frodo said that Gandalf had been lost in Moria, Faramir continues, reflecting that it is hard indeed to believe that one of so great wisdom and of power, for many wonderful things he did among us, could perish, and so much lore be taken from the world. This Mithrandir was, I now guess, more than a lawmaster, a great mover of the deeds that are done in our time. So Faramir recognised Gandalf's power, but only belatedly realised that Gandalf wasn't just a lawmaster. And he knew that Gandalf had been in the West in his youth. He was probably clever enough to piece together a hazy outline of what Gandalf was, but didn't dispute the idea that Gandalf could die, so clearly didn't have him down as an immortal Maya. It's probably reasonable to assume that Boromir, who was close to Faramir, would have been in roughly the same position. So that leaves 3. Gimli seems not to think too deeply about the matter. He knows that Gandalf is the wizard that helped his father, Thorin, and the rest recapture Erebor, but dwarves' minds are hard to fathom and don't seem that focused on things related to Valinor, other than Aule. So Gimli is probably also in the group of people who realise Gandalf is powerful and special, but doesn't really engage his curiosity beyond that. Legolas is different, though. As an immortal elf himself and son of the Elven King Thranduil, he will certainly both have encountered Gandalf several times, or at least heard tell of him, and know about Valinor and its denizens. Furthermore, Thranduil may well have grown up in Doriath in the First Age. His father Odofer was definitely there, and the Queen of Doriath was Melian the Maya, so Legolas's father may well have met someone who unambiguously was a Maya, and knew therefore what they were like. So it's not too much of a leap to suggest that Legolas might well have had quite a good idea of who or what Gandalf was, even if he didn't know for sure. That's how we can square it with Tolkien's assertion that only 3 people knew. Others may have guessed, but not known for sure. And I think we can add Aragorn to that list. Aragorn grew up as the foster son of Elrond, who did know who Gandalf was, and spent long years with him sharing his mission. He was fully aware of how powerful Gandalf was. Witness this response to Frodo asking whether the Nazgul might have held up Gandalf. "I do not know of anything else that could have hindered him, except the enemy himself," said Strider. "But do not give up hope. Gandalf is greater than you Shire folk know. As a rule, you can only see his jokes and toys, but this business of ours will be his greatest task." So he knows Gandalf's task, and he knows quite how powerful he is. He will also know the lore of the West, and will have seen firsthand for years what Gandalf is like. He's also quite wise and insightful. So, yes, I suspect that Aragorn had a very clear idea about who Gandalf really was, even if he didn't 100% technically know. But what does it matter that though some of the Fellowship may have had a good idea what manner of being Gandalf was, most didn't? Well, it matters that they thought Gandalf was lost in Moria, so carried on without hoping he might return. Incidentally, it's quite noticeable the difference in reaction too between Galadriel, who did know that Gandalf was a Maya and takes news of his passing in her stride, and Celeborn, who perhaps didn't know and seems much more affected by the news. It also matters that Gandalf clearly didn't tell many people, because he didn't want many people to know. He was very focused on not wanting to be directing people or influencing people because of his power or status. He was about support and encouragement, not leading or forcing. Literarily, it's probably also important that although we are quite clear that Gandalf and the rest of the Astari were Maiar, Tolkien was a bit more vague than you might think. Christopher Tolkien, who obviously had access to all of his father's writings and thoughts on the subject, simply states that we must assume that they, the Astari, were all Maiar, that is, persons of the angelic order, though not necessarily of the same rank. The Maiar were spirits, but capable of self-incarnation, and could take humane, especially elvish, forms. That's an assumption rather than a rock-solid fact. And if you dive into Unfinished Tales, you can even find Tolkien writing about how some faithful later believed Gandalf to be Manwë himself, intervening in Middle-earth directly. Tolkien says that, although he doesn't think that's the case, I quote, "I do not, of course, know the truth of the matter, and if I did, it would be a mistake to be more explicit than Gandalf was." And Gandalf, of course, never actually confirms that he is a Maiar. Indeed, it may surprise you to learn that the word Maiar, or Maiar, is never actually used in The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, or anything Tolkien published in his lifetime about Middle-earth. We only know of it via writings published later, like The Silmarillion or Unfinished Tales. We are forced to conclude that Tolkien clearly didn't think that it was important for the readers at the time, or the characters in the story, to know exactly what manner of being Gandalf was. Because the important thing about Gandalf is not a technical distinction between whether he was an emissary of the Valar or a Maiar or both. It is his heart, his character. It seems that Saruman was of the same nature as Gandalf, indeed more powerful, but his path was very different. Sometimes Tolkien teaches simple truths, and when it comes to Gandalf, and anyone I suppose, what really matters is not where he's from, or technically what kind of being he is, or what other people think of him, but the content of his character. Probably only 3 or 4 people in all Middle-earth knew exactly what kind of being Gandalf was. Probably quite a few more, including Aragorn and maybe 1 or 2 others in the Fellowship, knew a lot and could probably guess more. But everyone who met him knew Gandalf's character. And that was enough. If you'd like to see more videos like this, my Lord of the Rings playlist is on the left of your screen now. Or to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon on the right of your screen. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.
All hands, prepare for phase jump.
What actually are the Silmarils? The Silmarillion is named after them, and they seem to cast a long shadow in the story. But what are they, and why are they so important? Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to In Deep Geek. If you'd like to see more videos about great fantasy stories like The Lord of the Rings, A Song of Ice and Fire, and The Witcher, then this could be the channel for you. Welcome. The Silmarils are obviously central to the Silmarillion, or at least the largest part of it. The Quenta Silmaril, literally the history of the Silmarils, is the largest of the 5 books in the Silmarillion, and the most story-driven, with great characters and narratives. It's clear Tolkien loved writing about them. By the time of The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarils were ancient history, but they still get mentioned several times. So, what were they, and why were they so important?
Yes, Commander.
To understand their creation, we have to go way back in time, to the years of the trees, before even the First Age. In that time, light was brought to the land of the Valar by 2 trees, Telperion and Lorelin. The only other source of light then being the stars. And the light of these trees was beautiful, just pure and bright and beautiful, holy almost. Now at the time there was a Noldorin elf by the name of Feanor. I'm sure I'll do more videos on him because he really was a hugely important and charismatic figure. Heir to the kingship of the Noldor, a mighty warrior, a linguist and a craftsman without equal. He made the Palantiri, those ancient powerful seeing stones we come across in The Lord of the Rings, for example, as well as many other wonders. But his masterwork was the creation of the Silmarils, 3 jewels that held the light of the 2 trees, Telperion and Lorelin. This was an astonishing feat, and there are many layers to this story. He was inspired, so it was said, by Galadriel's hair, which shone bright gold and silver, and people said captured the light of the 2 trees in its tresses. The relationship between those 2 is fascinating and sometimes a bit creepy. 3 times he asked for a tress of her hair, and 3 times she refused him. Whatever he wanted her hair for, Feanor clearly wanted to capture and preserve the light of the 2 trees forever. Perhaps there was even some premonition here of the fate of the trees, for they would not last, and Feanor poured all of his craft and effort into the creation and crafting of the Silmarils. This is what we read about it in the Silmarillion. He began a long and secret labour, and he summoned all his lore and his power and his subtle skill, and at the end of all, he made the Silmarils. As 3 great jewels they were in form, but not until the end, not until the sun passes and the moon falls, shall it be known of what substance they were made. Like the crystal of diamonds, it appeared, and yet was more strong than adamant, so that no violence could mar it or break it within the kingdom of Arda. Yet that crystal was to the Silmarils but as is the body to the children of Iluvatar, the house of its inner fire, that is within it and yet in all parts of it, and is its life. And the inner fire of the Silmarils Fëanor made of the blended light of the trees of Valinor, which lives in them yet, though the trees have long withered and shine no more. Therefore, even in the darkness of the deepest treasury, the Silmarils of their own radiance shone like the stars of Varda. And yet, as were they indeed living beings, they rejoiced in light and received it and gave it back in hues more marvellous than before. All who dwelt in Aman were filled with wonder and delight at the work of Fëanor, and Varda hallowed the Silmarils, so that thereafter no mortal flesh, nor hands unclean, nor anything of evil will might touch them, but it was scorched and withered. And Mandos foretold that the fates of Arda, earth, sea and air lay locked within them. Impressive stuff. Made from an entirely new substance, unbreakable and somehow, as he had intended, capturing the very light of the 2 trees of Valinor. They shone in the dark and were even brighter in the light. The Valar hallowed them, so that no mortal or evil hand could touch them without being burned. The feat of their creation was unparalleled and unrepeatable. Fëanor alone knew the secret of their creation, and he had poured so much of himself into it that he knew that he could never make any more. They were unique, beautiful, and awe-inspiring. But the irony is that despite their being beautiful and hallowed, they were the cause of colossal amounts of pain and harm and downright evil. As is the way with a lot of Tolkien's in-world artifacts. Think of the One Ring and the Arkenstone as well. Their mere astonishing presence started to cause people to covet them, and that led to confrontation, strife, war, and tragedy. People's desire to possess the Silmarils led to much of the conflict of the First Age, hence the story of the First Age in the Silmarillion being named the Quenta Silmaril. The first person to succumb to an obsession with the Silmarils was Fëanor himself. He alternately wore them with great pride and then locked them away so that no one else could touch or see them. Then Melkor, Morgoth, also started to covet them. At the time he was pretending to be a reformed character living in Valinor, but secretly was turning the Noldor against the Valar and each other. To be fair to Fëanor, he never trusted nor liked Morgoth, but still the Dark Lord began manipulating him. Fëanor fell out with his half-brother and went off in exile with the Silmarils and with his father, causing a deep rift in Valinor. When he returned to make up with Fingolfin, his half-brother, after the Valar had rather belatedly realised that a lot of all this was Morgoth's fault, Morgoth struck. He enlisted Ungoliant, a horrific spider-like figure that could suck life and light out of the world, and killed the 2 trees, poisoning them so that they could no longer provide their light to the world. The Valar understandably turned to Fëanor. His Silmarils held the light of the trees, and the Valar could perhaps use that to bring the trees back, to restore light to Arda. But Fëanor refused. The Silmarils were his, and he could never replace them, so he would never give them up. But then the news came. While Fëanor was talking with the Valar, Morgoth had taken the Silmarils himself from Fëanor's home, killing Fëanor's father in the process. Fëanor, now king of the Noldor, grew angry at everyone. Morgoth, the Valar, Fingolfin, everyone. They all wanted to take his Silmarils. He led his people to Middle-earth to reclaim the Silmarils from Morgoth, and made his sons swear an oath that they would not let anyone stand between them and reclaiming the Silmarils. What happened next was perhaps inevitable, but still tragic. In Middle-earth, Fëanor and the Noldor attacked the forces of Morgoth and lost. Feanor died, though his son survived to cling to their oath. There is obviously a lot more to that part of the story, but it's worth pausing to understand the gravity of what had just happened. With the death of the two trees, light had gone from the world, and the only means of saving those trees, the Silmarils, were now in the possession of Morgoth. The Valar cut their losses. They salvaged what they could from the trees and made the sun and the moon, and with that a new way of reckoning time came into being, and the First Age proper began. The Silmarils were